What if the people sworn to protect you were the ones who pulled the trigger? Did you know that corruption within the police force has led to some of the biggest criminal cover-ups in history? How far would you go if the system that was supposed to serve justice destroyed your family? This is the story of Detective Ethan Cole, a man who spent 20 years running from his past, until his past came knocking on his door. A case that begins as a simple investigation into corrupt cops soon unravels a conspiracy so deep that it reaches to the highest levels of power. And at the heart of it, the truth behind his father's murder. But some secrets were never meant to be revealed. And the closer Ethan gets to the truth, the deadlier the game becomes. Get ready for a breathtaking story of revenge, corruption, and redemption. The war for justice begins now. Before we dive in, tell us, do you believe the justice system always protects the innocent? Or are there forces working behind the scenes to keep the truth buried? Comment below and let's uncover this mystery together. The golden light of the setting sun shimmered across the still surface of the lake, casting long shadows through the dense trees surrounding it. Officer Daniel Cole sat at the edge of the dock, his fishing rod resting beside him. His 10-year-old son, Ethan, sat cross-legged beside him, fidgeting with the small tackle box. "You think we'll catch anything today, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice full of hope. Daniel chuckled, ruffling Ethan's dark brown hair. "It's not always about catching something, kiddo. Sometimes it's just about the peace." Ethan grinned, leaning back on his hands, enjoying the quiet moment with his father. But the stillness didn't last. A rustling from the nearby trees made Daniel tense. His instincts from years on the force kicked in immediately. He stood abruptly, placing a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan, listen to me," Daniel whispered, his voice urgent. "Go hide. Now." Ethan hesitated, his father's sudden shift in demeanor unsettling him. "Dad, go son. Now." Before Ethan could argue, two men emerged from the tree line, their faces obscured by black ski masks. They moved with purpose, too calculated for this to be a random attack. Daniel positioned himself between the men and the direction Ethan had run. "What do you want?" he demanded, his hand hovering near his hip, where his gun usually sat, but he had left it in the car. The taller man lifted a gun, leveling it at Daniel's chest. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Officer Cole." Daniel's jaw clenched. "If this is about money, I don't—" "It's not about money," the second man cut in. "It's about what you know." The gunshot shattered the silence. Ethan, crouched in the brush, clamped his hands over his mouth to stifle his scream. He watched in horror as his father staggered back, clutching his stomach. Another shot rang out, and another. Daniel collapsed onto the dock, his lifeless eyes staring up at the darkening sky. The two men stood over him for a moment before disappearing into the trees, leaving behind nothing but the sound of Ethan's ragged breathing. Ethan jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he stared at the ceiling, the remnants of the nightmare clawing at the edges of his consciousness. He ran a shaking hand through his damp hair. Beside him, Olivia stirred. "Another one," she murmured sleepily. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, same one." Olivia propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face. "You haven't had them in a while." "I know." Ethan swung his legs over the bed, rubbing his temples. "It's just something about this new case is making me remember." Olivia placed a gentle hand on his back. "Be careful, Ethan. You know how you get when you start looking into the past." Ethan nodded, but the unease in his gut told him that this wasn't just about old memories. Something was stirring. The FBI field office buzzed with activity as Ethan walked into the briefing room. Special Agent Claire Lawson was already at the front, flipping through slides on a large monitor. "All right, let's get started," she said. "We're looking into police corruption linked to the Carter drug ring. Officers have been moving product, laundering money, and keeping their noses clean by eliminating threats." Ethan leaned forward as names appeared on the screen. Then, his breath caught. Officer Roy Tate, 22nd Precinct. Ethan's father's precinct. His fingers curled into a fist on the table. Claire noticed his reaction. "Something wrong?" Ethan cleared his throat. "I know that name." Claire frowned. "How?" "He worked with my father." A tense silence filled the room. Claire exchanged a glance with another agent. You sure you want in on this? Ethan's jaw tightened. I have to be. Walking through the halls of the 22nd precinct was like stepping into a ghost town. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Ethan and Claire entered. The officers who weren't outright avoiding them watched with barely concealed suspicion. Ethan approached the front desk. I need to speak to Officer Roy Tate. The desk sergeant hesitated before muttering, He's in the back, but he won't talk to you. Let me worry about that. Claire and Ethan moved through the narrow corridors until they found Tate's office. The door was slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open. Tate looked up from his desk, his face hardening. I don't have time for this. Ethan stepped inside, arms crossed. I think you do. Tate exhaled sharply. Listen, Cole, whatever you think you're doing, drop it. Walk away. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Why? What are you so afraid of? Tate leaned in, lowering his voice. They killed your father, Cole, and they'll kill you too if you don't stop digging. Later that night, Ethan's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Who is this? Tate's voice came through, rough and urgent. You were right. Meet me at the old parking garage on 7th. No cops. No FBI. Just you. Ethan pulled up to the dimly lit garage an hour later. Tate stood near the back, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets. Talk, Ethan demanded. Tate shifted uncomfortably. Your father was onto something. Something big. The cops weren't just dirty. They were working for someone higher up. Who? Before Tate could answer, the screech of tires echoed through the garage. A black SUV sped toward them. Run! Tate shouted. Gunfire erupted. Tate was hit first, collapsing onto the pavement. Ethan dove behind a pillar, drawing his weapon. But the SUV peeled away before he could fire a shot. He rushed to Tate's side. Blood pooled beneath the man as he gasped. It goes higher than you think. His eyes glazed over. Ethan sat back, breathing heavily, as the truth solidified in his mind. This wasn't just about his father. This was a war, and it had just begun. Ethan sat at his desk in the dimly lit FBI archive room, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. He flipped through case files, his fingers skimming over the documents his father had once handled. The need for answers clawed at his insides. What are you looking for, exactly? Claire asked, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. Ethan didn't glance up. Anything that connects my father's murder to what's happening now. There's something in here. Something he was working on that got him killed. After nearly an hour of searching, he found it. A small, battered notebook wedged between reports. The pages were covered in shorthand and cryptic notes. He turned to Claire, his expression grim. My dad was tracking corruption higher up the chain. He knew something was off in the 22nd precinct. He wrote down a name. Claire moved closer. Who? Ethan exhaled sharply, staring at the circled name. Captain Richard Vaughn. Ethan pushed open the heavy glass doors of the police headquarters. Vaughn's office was at the far end of the building, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The man himself sat behind his desk, a cup of coffee in hand, his expression unreadable as Ethan stepped inside. Agent Cole, Vaughn greeted, voice even. What can I do for the FBI today? Ethan took a seat without invitation, setting his father's notebook on the desk. Recognize this? Vaughn's eyes flicked down, but his expression didn't change. Should I? Ethan leaned forward. My father was investigating corruption before he was murdered. Your name is all over his notes. So tell me, Captain, what were you involved in? Vaughn exhaled slowly and leaned back. Daniel was a good cop, but sometimes good cops stick their noses where they don't belong. Ethan's blood ran cold. So you do know something? Vaughn shook his head. I know that you're wasting your time. Whatever your father was onto, it got him killed. And if you don't want to end up the same way, I suggest you walk away. Ethan stood. I'm not going anywhere. As he walked out, Vaughn's voice followed him. Then you'd better watch your back, Agent Cole. The streets were quiet as Ethan pulled his car into his apartment complex's underground garage. He killed the engine, rubbing his temples. The weight of the past 2 days pressed down on him. Then he noticed it. A dark van parked across the lot. The hairs on his neck stood on end. His gut screamed a warning, but before he could react, two masked men burst from the vehicle, guns drawn. Ethan dove behind a concrete pillar as bullets ricocheted off the pavement. He reached for his sidearm, fired 2 shots. One hit a tire, sending the van swerving. The gunman retreated as the vehicle peeled away, tires screeching into the night. Heart pounding, Ethan stayed crouched behind cover, breathing heavily. This wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a message. Ethan stepped into his apartment, shaken but trying not to show it. Olivia was waiting in the living room, arms crossed. Her expression darkened when she saw the tension in his face. "Ethan, what happened?" He hesitated, but there was no point lying. "They came for me tonight." She inhaled sharply. "Jesus, Ethan, and you're still going to keep digging?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I have to live. I can't walk away from this." She stepped closer, gripping his hands. "You can. You just won't. And I get it, I do. But I'm scared." Ethan swallowed hard. "I promise I'll be careful. But I can't stop now." Olivia looked at him, then finally nodded, though worry lingered in her eyes. "Just don't make me a widow, Ethan." The next morning, Ethan met Claire at the field office, exhaustion weighing him down. She was already at her desk, a grim look on her face. "What is it?" he asked, sitting across from her. Claire pushed a folder toward him. "I followed the money trail from the Carter ring. It doesn't just stop at dirty cops. It leads to politicians, government officials." Ethan flipped through the documents, his stomach tightening. "My father wasn't just looking at corrupt cops. He was uncovering something much bigger." Claire nodded. "And that means you're in more danger than we thought." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then we bring them all down." Claire exhaled. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Ethan smirked. "Never. The war was only just beginning." Ethan stood outside Captain Richard Vaughn's estate, watching as the FBI tactical team moved in. The raid had been planned swiftly after Claire's discovery of Vaughn's ties to the Carter ring. Ethan's hands clenched into fists as agents swarmed the property, shouting commands. Within minutes, Vaughn was dragged out, his face unreadable as his hands were cuffed behind his back. He locked eyes with Ethan. "You think this is justice?" Vaughn sneered. "You have no idea what you're stepping into." Ethan stepped closer, his voice low. "I know you were there the night my father was murdered. I know you covered up what really happened." Vaughn shook his head with an almost amused smile. "If you think I was the one calling the shots, you're chasing ghosts." Ethan watched as Vaughn was shoved into the back of a squad car, unease creeping up his spine. Something about this felt too easy. The interrogation room was cold, the air thick with tension. Vaughn sat across from Ethan, hands still cuffed, his expression unreadable. Ethan slid a file across the table. "We have your financial records, witness statements, and a direct link between you and the Carter ring." "It's over, Vaughn." Vaughn smirked. "That's cute, Cole. You think you've won?" Ethan leaned forward. "You were there the night my father was murdered. Admit it." Vaughn exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I didn't kill your father, Ethan. I didn't give the order either." Ethan's patience thinned. "Then who did?" Vaughn's eyes darkened. "You're not ready for that answer." Before Ethan could push further, the door burst open. Claire entered, her face pale. "We have a problem." She tossed a file on the table. Ethan opened it, and his stomach dropped. It was a signed confession from Vaughn, detailing his involvement in the murder of Daniel Cole and the drug operation. But there was one glaring issue. Vaughn had never written it. Someone had framed him, ensuring that Ethan would stop looking. Vaughn smirked. "Looks like someone wants you to close the case, Cole. The question is, who?" Ethan paced his office, frustration boiling inside him. "Someone's tying up loose ends. Vaughn might be guilty, but he's not the mastermind." Claire tapped her fingers on the desk. "We need another lead." A knock on the door interrupted them. A junior agent stepped in. "There's an informant willing to talk. Said he has info on Vaughn and the Carter ring. He wants to meet tonight." Ethan grabbed his jacket. "Set it up." The meeting was arranged at an abandoned warehouse. The moment Ethan and Claire arrived, they knew something was wrong. The doors were ajar, the air heavy with the metallic scent of blood. Inside, their informant lay slumped against the wall, a bullet between his eyes. On the floor beside him, scrawled in blood, was a single message. Too late. Back at headquarters, Ethan stormed into his supervisor's office. This isn't just about Vaughn. Someone higher up is pulling the strings. His boss, Assistant Director Reynolds, sighed. Drop it, Cole. Vaughn's confession is solid. Case closed. Ethan's fists clenched. You don't believe that. Someone fabricated that confession. And now our only other lead is dead. Reynolds exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. Listen to me, Cole. You've already stirred up a hornet's nest. Keep pushing, and you're going to end up like your father. Ethan's blood turned to ice. What did you just say? Reynolds hesitated before shaking his head. That's not a threat. It's a warning. There are forces at play here that you can't control. Walk away. Ethan stepped back, his mind racing. His own superior was either scared or complicit. Claire met Ethan outside the precinct, her face grave. I did some digging after we found that fake confession. Vaughn was a dead end, but I found something else. She handed him a file. Ethan flipped it open, his pulse hammering. A name stared back at him. Chief Frank Bennett. Ethan's stomach twisted. That's impossible. Bennett was my father's friend. He trained him. Claire's voice was tight. He also signed off on every missing evidence report connected to the Carter ring. He covered up investigations, silenced witnesses, and had access to all precinct personnel records, including your father's. Ethan's mind reeled. Everything he had believed about his father's murder was shifting beneath him. Bennett didn't just cover for them, Claire whispered. He was running the entire operation. And if Vaughn wasn't the one who gave the order, Ethan clenched his jaw. Then it was Bennett. Claire nodded. We finally have our real target. Ethan stared at the name on the file, his hands tightening into fists. He had spent years chasing the wrong man. Now, he was ready to bring down the right one. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of the overhead light casting sharp shadows across his face. Olivia stood by the sink, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, worry etched into every line of her face. You got another message, didn't you? She asked quietly. Ethan nodded, tossing his phone onto the table. The text still glowed on the screen. Drop it or die. Olivia inhaled sharply. Ethan, this is serious. I know, he said, rubbing his temples, but I can't walk away. Not now. She moved closer, placing a hand on his arm. Then promise me you'll be careful. Ethan met her gaze and forced a small smile. I promise. As Olivia returned to the sink, Ethan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Claire. We have a problem, she said the moment he answered. Bennett knows we're onto him, and he's making his move. Ethan drove through the city, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He had barely made it 2 blocks before he noticed the black SUV in his rearview mirror. It followed every turn he made. His heartbeat quickened. Then, without warning, the SUV surged forward, ramming into his car. His body jerked against the seatbelt as his vehicle skidded across the pavement. Gunfire erupted. Bullets shattered the rear windshield. Ethan ducked, yanking the wheel hard to the right, barely missing a parked car. He reached for his gun just as the SUV pulled up alongside him. A masked gunman leaned out, aiming straight at him. Before the shot could be fired, another vehicle came out of nowhere, slamming into the SUV's side. The force sent it careening into a lamppost. Ethan's heart pounded as he recognized the driver, Claire. She jumped out, gun drawn, firing 2 shots at the remaining gunmen before they could recover. They scrambled back into the wrecked SUV and sped away, tires screeching. Claire ran up to Ethan's car, breathless. You okay? Ethan exhaled sharply, adrenaline coursing through his veins. I am now. She nodded grimly. That was Bennett's message. Next time, he won't miss. Back at the FBI office, Claire placed a thick file on the table in front of Ethan. Tate kept records. Ethan's brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages. It was all there. Evidence of money laundering, backdoor deals, names of officers involved. And at the very top, Frank Bennett's signature appeared on multiple reports. He was never just covering it up, Ethan muttered. He was orchestrating everything. Claire nodded. And we finally have enough to take him down. Ethan closed the file, his jaw tightening. Then let's do it. Ethan stood in the doorway of his apartment, watching Olivia as she packed a small bag. Just until this is over, he said softly. I need you to be safe. She turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't want to leave you alone in this. Ethan stepped forward, brushing a hand down her arm. You're not. Claire's with me. But if Bennett knows I'm coming, he'll go after you. I need to know you're safe. Olivia nodded reluctantly. Promise me you'll come back. He kissed her forehead. I promise. She lingered for a moment before grabbing her bag and walking out the door. Ethan watched until she was gone, then turned back into the apartment, his fists clenching at his sides. It was time. Ethan and Claire stood outside Frank Bennett's mansion, the FBI SWAT team positioned around them. Claire checked her weapon, then glanced at Ethan. Ready? He nodded. Let's get this bastard. The lead agent gave the signal. Go. The team stormed the mansion, breaking down the front doors. Ethan moved swiftly through the hallways, gun raised. They cleared room after room, empty. Something wasn't right. Then a voice echoed from the top of the stairs. Agent Cole. Ethan turned sharply, his gun trained on Frank Bennett, who stood at the top of the grand staircase, a pistol in one hand, a smirk on his face. You've been a real pain, Bennett said casually, but I suppose I should have expected that. Your father was the same way. Ethan's finger twitched on the trigger. Put the gun down, Bennett. It's over. Bennett chuckled. You really think this ends with me? You're playing a game you don't understand, Cole. I'm just one piece on the board. Claire stepped forward. Enough talking. Hands where we can see them. Bennett sighed dramatically, then suddenly raised his gun. Not at Ethan, but at Claire. Ethan fired first. Bennett's body jerked backward as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He collapsed onto the stairs, gun slipping from his fingers. Agents rushed forward, securing him in cuffs. As they hauled him to his feet, Bennett grinned through the pain. You think this is over, don't you? Ethan stepped closer, his voice cold. You're done. Bennett's smirk never wavered. We'll see about that. Ethan watched as they dragged him away, his mind racing. Because he knew Bennett was right. This wasn't over. Not even close. Ethan stood in the sterile interrogation room, the two-way mirror behind him reflecting the cold determination in his eyes. Frank Bennett sat across from him, his arm in a sling from the bullet wound Ethan had given him the night before. Despite the pain, Bennett's smirk remained firmly in place. You think you've won? Bennett's voice was hoarse, but laced with amusement. You don't even know what you've stepped into. Ethan leaned forward, resting his hands on the metal table. You ordered my father's murder. You ran the Carter ring through the precinct. You made good cops disappear when they got too close. But it's over. Bennett exhaled, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? I didn't give the order, Cole. Ethan's stomach twisted. Then who did? Bennett chuckled darkly. You think I was the mastermind? I was just a cog in a much bigger machine. Ethan's fists clenched. Who? Bennett? Who's pulling the strings? Bennett sighed dramatically. If I tell you, I'm dead before morning. And if you keep pushing, you will be too. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew Bennett wasn't lying. The courtroom was packed. The press lined the back rows, cameras flashing as Bennett was led to his seat in handcuffs. Ethan sat near the front, his eyes never leaving the man who had orchestrated his father's murder. Bennett's attorney, Marcus Hartley, adjusted his tie and began his opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen, my client has been misrepresented. Yes, he made mistakes. Yes, he was involved in illegal dealings. But he did not kill Officer Daniel Cole. And he was not the mastermind behind this operation. Ethan stiffened as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Hartley continued, the prosecution wants you to believe that Frank Bennett acted alone, but the truth is far more complicated. He was simply a man following orders. Ethan clenched his fists. Hartley was spinning the narrative, creating doubt. And the worst part? There was some truth to it. Ethan returned to his office, exhaustion weighing on him. Claire was already waiting, arms crossed. You saw how they played it, she said. They're setting up a bigger defense, trying to shift the blame. Ethan nodded, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. He hesitated before answering. Cole. A voice, low and distorted, came through the speaker. Bennett was just a pawn. You keep digging, and you won't make it to trial. The line went dead. Claire's expression darkened. That sounded like a promise. Ethan exhaled, his grip on the phone tightening. Then let's make sure they regret making it. Later that night, Olivia sat at their dining table, papers spread out before her. She had spent years as a journalist, and her instincts were telling her there was more to the story. When Ethan walked in, she didn't look up. I found something. He moved to her side, scanning the highlighted reports. These are financial records from the precinct. She nodded, and they connect back to campaign donations for Senator Malcolm Briggs. Ethan's blood ran cold. Briggs. Olivia met his gaze. He's the one above Bennett, the one who's really in charge. Ethan sat down heavily. Bennett had been a monster, but Briggs? He had power that extended beyond the police force, beyond the city. And if he had killed Daniel Cole to protect his empire, he wouldn't hesitate to do the same to Ethan. Back in the courtroom, the judge's gavel pounded against the desk. Silence fell over the room as the verdict was read. We, the jury, find the defendant, Frank Bennett, guilty on all charges. A collective exhale rippled through the room. Ethan felt a moment of relief. It was over. Bennett turned, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Then, as the bailiff led him away, he muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." Ethan watched as the doors closed behind him, his gut telling him the same thing. Because Bennett was just one piece of the puzzle, and the real fight was only beginning. Ethan stood in the cemetery, hands in his pockets, staring down at the simple headstone that bore his father's name. The crisp autumn wind rustled the leaves around him, but he barely noticed. He let out a slow breath. "I got him, Dad. Bennett's done." The words felt hollow, though, because deep down, he knew the war wasn't over. A shadow moved behind him. Ethan turned to find Claire standing a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "I figured you'd be here." He gave a small nod. "Needed a minute." Claire crossed her arms. "A minute won't be enough. Not for what's coming next." Ethan exhaled. "I know." Later that night, Olivia sat on the couch, staring at the laptop screen. Files upon files of corruption, names tied to the case, and one looming figure in the center, Senator Malcolm Briggs. She looked up as Ethan walked in, exhaustion clear on his face. "I can't let this go," she said, her voice steady. "Briggs is still out there. He's the one who gave the order. And if I can expose him..." Ethan sighed, running a hand down his face. "Liv, this isn't your fight." She squared her shoulders. "It is now. This isn't just about your father anymore, Ethan. It's about how deep this goes." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we do this together." Across town, inside a dimly lit office, a man watched a surveillance feed of Ethan Cole leaving the courthouse. A thick cigar smoldered in his fingers, tendrils of smoke curling into the air. A knock at the door. A suited figure entered. "Sir, Bennett's been taken care of." "But Cole..." "He's persistent." The man exhaled a plume of smoke. "We'll need to deal with him." The suited figure hesitated. "Publicly or quietly?" The man smirked. "Let's see how far he's willing to go first." Claire slid a file across Ethan's desk. "We just got this in. Surveillance footage from an underground meeting. Politicians, law enforcement, corporate heads. And Briggs is right in the middle of it." Ethan flipped through the images, his gut twisting. They don't just control the cops. They control everything. Claire met his gaze. "You started something you can't finish alone." Ethan leaned back, his jaw tight. "Then I guess I'll need backup." Ethan stood at the edge of the city skyline, looking down at the lights below. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just chasing ghosts. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about justice. It was about bringing down the people who thought they were untouchable. He turned to Claire and Olivia, both standing beside him. "Bennett was just the beginning," Ethan said, voice firm. "Justice isn't done. Not yet." The wind howled around them, but Ethan didn't flinch. Because he wasn't running anymore. He was going to war. As we've seen, Detective Ethan Cole's relentless pursuit of justice has uncovered a conspiracy far greater than he ever imagined. But one question remains: how deep does the corruption go? Could powerful figures in politics and law enforcement really operate above the law for decades without being exposed? And if so, what does that mean for those brave enough to challenge them? Let us know in the comments. What would you do in Ethan's place? Would you keep digging, even if it meant risking everything? If you enjoyed this gripping story of revenge, corruption, and redemption, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more deep dives into thrilling narratives like this. We've got more intense stories coming your way, so stick around, because the next mystery is just beginning.